Hi, I'm Doug Brignole.
And I'm Mo Larby from Smart Training 365. Welcome to the Brig 20 videos.
We're glad you've joined us. We're going to talk about the Brig 20, and that refers to the 20 best anatomical motions for physique development and muscular development. Now, some of these have alternatives, and we're going to show you all of these exercises one by one. So come and join us. Let's get started.
All right, next exercise. Now, this is difficult from balance point of view, because doing that exercise without weight is already
even without weight, yeah. You know, I should mention that this coach has a PhD in kinesiology.
Yeah.
Which, of course, you know, just like people who have a PhD in exercise physiology, don't necessarily understand mechanics, don't necessarily understand physics. So we can't look at the PhD and say, oh, well, then it must be a safe exercise because this person has a PhD. I mean, even Wayne Westcott, PhD, who endorsed my book, and is one of the most renowned exercise professors of exercise science in the country, has himself written 30 books. He's actually told us, even in video, he's told us that exercise physiology courses, university courses, are tremendously lacking in physics and tremendously lacking in biomechanics.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's not reasonable for us to look at just letters at the end of a name that says PhD and assume that, you know, the person is knowledgeable, expert in an area that is involving mostly mechanics. There's an MD that is talking about nutrition. His MD is in psychology, right? So, or psychiatry, which of course, you know, is considerably different than biochemistry and nutrition. So, which is not to say that you can't then also learn it in another way,
right?
But you shouldn't ignore the fact that the PhD doesn't say, or the MD doesn't automatically guarantee expertise in an area where the MD or the PhD was not earned.
So what do you think of that exercise?
So, you know, again, I just think that, you know, it's anybody who would look at that would say, how likely am I to experience that on a football field? It is taking the first exercise we saw, which was the squat, and adding degrees of difficulty to it, right? So the lunge, of course, you know, has a different sort of mechanics than a regular squat. The front leg is doing basically a squat-like thing, hip extension, knee extension. And then the back leg is doing more hip flexion, right? It's kind of controlling that hip from collapsing with engagement of the hip flexor and quadricep. So it's more knee extension, hip flexion, no hip extension on that back leg. It's all on that front leg.
Yeah.
But separate from that, the instability there, you know, is and in my book, I explain why does an instability increases risk of injury. So the more unstable it becomes, the more the balance becomes difficult. And the more that you challenge it by adding weight, the more that you have to sort of explain or justify with benefit. Yes, the risk is going up, but the benefit is also going up because. So I don't see that movement being that valuable, and yet I see it being a higher risk exercise, a higher difficulty factor, which of course includes effort, which of course is, if it isn't being spent productively, then could be considered a waste of effort.
So it's a yellow.
Yeah, I frankly, I think that when you're doing a standard lunge, back lunge, front lunge with a pair of dumbbells, that is unstable enough to create a kind of athleticism that you might expect on the field. Adding vibrating weights by way of elastic bands, just increases the cost without necessarily increasing the benefit.
Okay. It is your favorite exercise, but
that's not the one I was going to talk about, but yeah.
No, I'm talking about the row.
Yeah. Now, in my book, what I explain in our course, what we explain is that any bent over row exercise includes more loading of the erector spinae than of the muscles that are pulling on the arms. And the reason for that is because let's just say that you were doing that same exact thing, but you were chest supported, right? That means your lower back doesn't have to keep you in that position.
Yeah.
And yet you're not lessening the load on the arms, right? The arms are pulling the weight. And then you can look at the movement and say which muscles are pulling on the weight, and we determine that by seeing a couple of things. One is the direction of the movement.
Yeah.
And the other is by looking at the line of force, right? And saying, because it's a 6 o'clock direction of resistance, any muscle that's at the 12 o'clock or any muscle origin that's at the 12 o'clock position will be the most loaded, whether that's your intention or not.
Yeah.
And the muscles that are not at that 12 o'clock position, which may be your target muscles, are going to be less loaded because they're not in line with the direction of force. They're not opposite position loaded. So when people do a bent over barbell row, they typically do it for their, quote, back muscles. And the back muscles, if you were to look at an anatomy chart, you would see the lats is a back muscle. Middle trapezius is a back muscle. What else is a back muscle? Well, the infraspinatus is a muscle you can see from the back, but the infraspinatus is an external shoulder rotator. It's part of the rotator cuff. So when you're doing a rowing exercise, you're not rotating that arm. So you're really not doing an infraspinatus exercise. And you are working the teres major, because the teres major is a little triangular muscle that goes from the scapula to the humerus, just underneath the rear deltoid and just above the lat. That thing works all the time. It works anytime you do rear deltoids. It works anytime you do lats. So that's not something you have to target. But a bent over barbell row is not pulling toward the spine.
Yeah, obviously he's doing it.
Right, he's pulling toward the back of the room. So he's getting a lot of rear deltoid load and teres major load. That's for sure. But he's getting 3 or 4 times more load on the lower back because he's not chest supported. Right. So that's the problem is when most people do bent over barbell row, they're not intending to work the lower back or the erector spinae. And yet it's getting more work. So what I would say is if it is your intention to work the erector spinae, then don't involve the arms. Don't do a rowing with it. Right. If you want to do a deadlift, do a deadlift. Right. And then you get, I want to say full range of motion, even though it isn't full range of motion for the erector spinae, because when you're doing a deadlift, you're maintaining rigidity in your spine. You're not actually rounding and arching your spine. That would be dynamic contraction of the erector spinae. What you're doing is isometric contraction of the erector spinae, but at least you're going through that position instead of holding it and then doing something for a muscle that isn't even really your target muscle. So the bent over barbell row itself is tremendously compromised for a number of reasons. It isn't a good bodybuilding exercise. And it isn't necessarily a good athletic exercise because there are better versions, right? You can do the same thing better for the hip extension muscles, and which are the glutes and the adductors, and the hamstrings, and for the erector spinae just by doing a deadlift. And there are people who try to pin me down and say, Doug Brignole says deadlifts are bad. It's not what I say. What I say is that the deadlift is mostly a hip extension exercise. If you look at someone from the side when they're doing a deadlift, that is the joint that's moving. That means the muscles that cross that joint, which are the hip extension muscles, are getting the dynamic work. And the erector spinae are maintaining rigidity in the spine so it doesn't fold and collapse while the hip is doing that extension. If you do a deadlift with a weight that still allows you to keep that upper body arched, right? This other person that was trying to criticize me, I said something I do, 40 or 50 pound deadlifts sort of in between some of the other exercises. And I do it as a hamstring stretch. I'm not doing it as a gluteus exercise. And the reason I'm not is because I have a machine right there that will work my gluteus way, way, way better, right? Because the erector spinae is weaker than the hip extension muscles. It does not have the bulk, it does not have the mass, it does not have the strength capacity that the hip extension muscles do. The hip extension muscles are very strong. Mm-hmm. So what happens is when people start to use a lot of weight on the deadlift, the first to fail is the erector spinae.
Yeah.
And the person doing the exercise may not even be aware that he is now no longer keeping his spine arch, that it's now starting to round. And now when you start to round the back, you start to increase the odds of herniating the intervertebral discs between the spine. And so the person that's deadlifting wants to lift the most that they can lift. And so they basically let the gluteus determine how much that is, never mind spinal risk. So again, what we just saw there is not that good for the muscles that are pulling the arms. It is relatively good for the glutes and the erector spinae, but it would be better if it was dynamic. It would be better if it was a deadlift with an amount of weight that may not be your maximum weight, but is the maximum amount of weight that you can do with good form, meaning keeping your spine perfectly arched and therefore your spine safe.
All right. So that's a yellow 2, right?
I hate to give these things either one of 3 ratings because, I just think that one is very low productivity and so much so that it would be a waste of energy and time. I don't see it being highly risky because of the weight was under this person's control, but it just really a waste of time. I think a better exercise would be a deadlift with a reasonable weight.
Okay. I feel the risk of this one.
You what?
I feel the risk of this one.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, me too.
Like I can feel my lower back right now while watching this.
Yeah. Yeah. And also the shoulders, the shoulder
shoulders,
joint.
of course.
Yeah. Robert Eckhart, the paleoanthropologist, and I had a conversation, a fairly lengthy conversation about overhead presses. And he agreed that there's nothing in the evolutionary record that would suggest early humans ever having a need to do that on any kind of overhead press, not even an incline press, but certainly not an overhead press. There would not have been any reason to do that for long periods of time on a regular basis. Even if you were trying to carry something from point A to point B, that's not frequent enough. If let's just say you and 5 other cavemen wanted to carry a log. Okay, well, you get the log over your head and you carry it, but you're not doing this with the log.
Yeah.
You get it up there and you carry it, and maybe you do that once in a while, but you don't do this often enough to cause an adaptation in the shoulder joint that would make it perfectly safe to do that kind of movement. So there is, of course, as we talk about extensively in our course, there is impingement syndrome, which is an irritation or an inflammation or perhaps even a rupture of the supraspinatus tendon, which is the tendon that comes from this muscle over the top, the supraspinatus. It comes out from underneath the acromion process. And so as soon as you push your arms underneath the acromion process, you squeeze that tendon. You also squeeze the subacromial bursa, which is a little gel pack that's in there. And these things are there for the occasional need to put a box on a shelf or whatever it is that we have to do occasionally. But you can overdo it, and certainly the heavier the weight you lift them, the more pressure there is, or the more there is holding down the scapula, and therefore preventing it from being pushed up by the humerus. You know, when you're doing a pull down or a chin up, the scapula is being pulled up, and so it's easy to get that thing out of the way. But when you have a downward pressing weight, it's harder because you're pushing against something that's pushing down, and so you are more inclined to get impingement syndrome. And then also, a large percentage of people do not have enough shoulder mobility to cause their forearm to go straight vertical when viewed from the side. So if I don't, I mean, that would be vertical. And you can experiment with this at home. If you go to the mirror, you know, and you try to get your arm perfectly vertical, and then you ask yourself, how much strain am I feeling in the shoulder joint? And the farther I go, the more strain there is, right? So you realize that a simple overhead press requires you to have that arm vertical so that it doesn't want to fall forward, right? So that it's in the neutral forward, backward direction. Just putting yourself into position for an overhead press strains the limits of external shoulder rotation. And when you can't rotate enough externally to make that arm vertical, and there's that forward slant to your forearm, it wants to fall forward. It becomes a rotational lever on this bone. Yeah. It wants to turn that humerus inside the shoulder socket. And in order to have that not happen, the external rotator muscles, which are the infraspinatus and the teres minor, they have to now work, but mostly the infraspinatus, they now have to work to prevent this. So in other words, you're reverse arm wrestling this weight while you're pushing it up over your head. Now, from a bodybuilding standpoint, we know that now anytime you rotate the arm, you take the side deltoid and you rotate it toward the rear. And that means that now you've rotated the side deltoid away from the line of force. So it will not be the most loaded muscle with the weight you're using. Yeah. The front deltoid rotates more on top. So it will be the one muscle that is more loaded than the side deltoid. And you might say, well, I want to work my front deltoid. And I would say, yeah, but you can work the front deltoid better with an exercise that doesn't have impingement risk syndrome and infraspinatus strain.
But he in this case, he wasn't doing it this way in the video. He was doing it here and then going like this.
All right. Well, then I would encourage people to put their arm in front and then ask themselves the same thing. How much external rotation do I have? Yes, you have more here than you do here, but you still have a limit to how much external rotation you can do. And ask yourself before you load up on any kind of weight, ask yourself, how much of a shoulder strain do I feel with no weight? Okay. And of course, when you're pushing up, and then of course he does, once he gets to the top, he does move his arm back. I don't know if you noticed that he gets to the top and then he shifts his shoulder back. Right. So he is squeezing the supraspinatus tendon. There is no doubt that he's squeezing it. There is no doubt that he's squeezing. Shaking. Yeah, there is no doubt that he's squeezing. Yeah, we haven't even gotten to that part yet. This is just the overhead movement. He is definitely squeezing his subacromial bursal. The question is, how much can he do that before it's too much? How long can he do that before he starts experiencing shoulder pain and then wondering why he has shoulder pain? Okay, so now we add the vibration to it. So now, again, as I said in the past, we'd have to say, okay, so it's unstable. It's triggering a certain type of physical action from you, presumably that you will then gain a proprioceptive advantage from. Applicable where? Applicable how? How likely is it that you're going to hit a jiggling, moving object directly over it if you're a football player? If anything, you're going to be hitting in front. You know, you're not going to be hitting up, and you're certainly not going to be hitting anything up that's jiggling and moving. And of course, as we know, so far I've talked only about the shoulder strain. And as you said, there's also lower back strain, right? Because the higher this weight gets, the more that it's requiring, you know, your torso to stabilize that. And there are better ways of stabilizing the torso. In fact, that first exercise was plenty torso stabilizing enough.
Mm-hmm.